The wagon was already 3 axles deep in mud when Grace Gentry decided that the Missouri River crossing was not going to kill her. Not today, not ever, and certainly not before she got her 4 children to California. That was the spring of 1873, and the great overland trail was still alive with the desperation of people who believed the West held something worth the suffering it demanded. Grace was 31 years old, a widow of 8 months, and she had sold every piece of furniture her late husband Thomas had ever owned, except for a carved oak chest that had belonged to his mother. The chest rode at the back of the wagon now, wedged between sacks of flour and a cast-iron stove that everyone had told her she was a fool to bring. She had brought it anyway, because some things were not negotiable, and warmth for 4 children was one of them. Her oldest was 12-year-old Daniel, a serious boy who had taken his father's death with a clenched jaw and had not cried once that Grace had seen, though she sometimes heard him at night pressing his face into the quilts. Then came Nora, who was 9 and kept a journal in careful looping handwriting despite Grace's reminders that journal ink cost money. Then came twins Henry and Rose, who were 6 years old and had been born on the same October evening that a lightning storm had knocked down the old maple tree in the yard, which the twins took as evidence that they were destined for remarkable things. Grace was not in the habit of discouraging that belief. Thomas had died of a fever that came fast and left nothing behind but debt. The farm in Ohio had been mortgaged twice. There was an uncle in Sacramento who had written twice offering land and steady work, and the kind of future that Ohio could no longer promise. Grace had read those letters until the paper went soft at the creases, and then she had made her decision. She had hired a wagon master named Elkins for the first stretch of the journey, paying him 3 months' wages up front out of money she had borrowed from the church. But Elkins had died of a sudden heart seizure somewhere near the Kansas border, and the small party of settlers he had been guiding had fractured and gone separate ways. Some turned back. Some joined another train further west. Grace had looked at her map, looked at her compass, looked at her 4 children, and kept going north and west because the alternative was to admit that Thomas's death had beaten her, and she had made a private promise to herself, standing over his grave, that she would not be beaten. That was the brutal arithmetic of her journey. No guide, no husband, no party. 1 wagon, 1 horse named Abraham who was sturdy but irritable, 4 children, a compass, a Winchester rifle she had learned to shoot from Thomas in the last year of his life when the tensions along the border roads had made it necessary, and a stubbornness that had been remarked upon so many times throughout her life that she had stopped hearing it as a criticism and started wearing it like a coat. She had crossed Kansas through April rains that turned the trail to syrup. She had repaired 2 broken wheel spokes herself using tools and a manual Thomas had kept in the chest. She had navigated a river crossing in which the water came up to Abraham's chest, while Daniel held the reins steady and Grace walked in the water beside the horse, talking to him in a low voice, because he calmed to her voice the way her children calmed to her voice, and that fact had struck her as both useful and unexpectedly tender. She had shot at 2 coyotes that came too close to camp one night, not hitting either of them but making enough noise to send them off. She had traded half a pound of salt for directions from a homestead family in Colorado who had been kind enough to feed the children biscuits. She had buried nothing. She had lost nothing she could not replace. She had arrived at the eastern edge of the Carson Valley, Nevada in the 3rd week of June, and the wagon wheel had given out entirely, cracking along a fault line with a sound like a gunshot, 2 miles outside of the town of Millhaven. Millhaven was not much of a town. It had a general store, a livery, a small church with a cracked bell, a land office that was open 3 days a week, a boarding house, a saloon, and a blacksmith. It had approximately 200 residents, which swelled to 300 in summer when the drovers came through with cattle headed north. It sat in a flat valley between low hills that turned golden in the summer heat, and a creek called Sanderson Creek ran along its eastern edge and gave it good water, which was the reason it existed at all. Clement Sullivan was the blacksmith. He was 34 years old, tall and broad through the shoulders in the way of men who work with iron all day, with dark hair that ran a little long and dark eyes that had the particular quality of still water, quiet on the surface, but with a depth that suggested movement underneath. He had come to Millhaven from Virginia 6 years ago with a friend named Patrick Doyle, who had been his closest friend since childhood, and Patrick had died of a snake bite 4 years ago, and Clement had stayed because leaving felt like a second abandonment. He owned the blacksmith shop outright. He had built the living quarters above it with his own hands. He was respected in Millhaven for the quality of his work, and for being a man of measured speech, who did not say foolish things, and did not allow himself to be drawn into the small cruelties that sometimes passed for social life in a town this size. He was not a man who talked easily about himself. He ate his meals alone or at the boarding house when Mrs. Henley was making her stew, and he attended church on Sundays without great fervor, but with genuine respect for the ritual of it. And he had not found a woman in Millhaven who felt like something more than pleasant company, and he had made a kind of quiet peace with the solitude of his life, the way a person makes peace with a window that sticks in the winter, acknowledging the inconvenience without letting it become a source of grief. He was reshaping a gate hinge when he heard the commotion. He heard it before he saw it, the sound of children's voices and the labored breathing of a horse, and the distinctive grinding scrape of a wagon being pulled on a broken wheel. He set down his hammer and walked to the open front of the shop and looked out into the main street of Millhaven, and what he saw was a woman guiding a limping wagon with the particular focused expression of someone who has been dealing with emergencies long enough that they have stopped being emergencies and started being simply the next problem to solve. The woman was lean from the trail, her dress the faded brown of long travel, her dark hair pinned up under a bonnet that had seen better days. She was walking alongside the horse, one hand on its bridle speaking to it. Behind her, through the gaps in the wagon cover, he could see faces, small faces, a boy who looked about 12 holding the reins inside, a girl behind him. Beside the wagon walked 2 smaller children, a boy and a girl who looked like twins, each of them carrying something, the boy a tin pot and the girl a cloth bundle, as if they had been trained to bring whatever they could carry in an emergency. Clement walked out to the street. "That wheel is finished," he said, because it was the truth and he did not see the point in saying it more gently than that. She looked at him with eyes that were dark brown and direct and so clear of self-pity that it stopped him for a moment. "I can see that," she said. "Are you the blacksmith?" "I am." "Good," she said. "Then you are exactly who I need." She said it the way a general says it to a scout, with a practical authority that had nothing to do with flirting or flattery, and for reasons Clement could not entirely name, that tone impressed him more than any soft word could have. He looked at the wheel. It was not salvageable as it was. He looked at the horse. Abraham was tired but sound. "I can have a new wheel fitted by tomorrow morning," he said. "You will need to stay the night." She nodded once. "What is the cost?" he told her. She did not flinch, though he could see her calculate something quickly behind her eyes. "Fair," she said. "And is there somewhere the children can sleep that is not too dear?" He thought of Mrs. Henley's boarding house, which was the only option in town. "Mrs. Henley runs the boarding house at the North End. She is a reasonable woman. Tell her Clement Sullivan sent you and she will give you a fair rate." The woman nodded again, then looked at her horse. "Can Abraham stay at your livery tonight? He has earned a good feed." "That is not my livery," Clement said. "That belongs to Ellis Cooper 2 doors down. But I will walk the horse over myself if you like, so you can get the children settled." She looked at him then with a different quality of attention, the kind you give someone when you are revising an opinion. "That is kind of you," she said, and she said it plainly without embellishment, but something in the plainness of it made it land more squarely than praise. "I am Clement Sullivan," he said. "Grace Gentry," she said, and held out her hand. He shook it. It was a firm handshake, trail calloused and direct. She gathered her children around her with a word and a look, and they came without argument, which said something about either her authority or the exhaustion of the journey or both. He watched them go up the street toward Mrs. Henley's, the boy Daniel carrying the heaviest bag without being asked, the girl Nora with her journal pressed to her chest, the twins walking in matching lockstep behind their mother. Clement took Abraham's bridle and walked the horse toward the livery. "You have had a long day," he told the horse. Abraham snorted with what might have been agreement. That night at Mrs. Henley's boarding house, Grace ate her first hot meal in 4 days. Mrs. Henley, who was a stout woman of 60 with a permanently cheerful expression and a boarding house that was the cleanest establishment in Millhaven, had taken one look at the 4 children and the trail-worn mother and had brought out extra bread without being asked. "Sullivan sent you," Mrs. Henley said, settling the bread on the table. "He did," Grace said. "Good man," Mrs. Henley said. "Quiet, but the good kind of quiet, not the suspicious kind." She refilled the children's water glasses. "Where are you headed?" "Sacramento," Grace said. "My uncle has land there." "Long way still," Mrs. Henley said, not unkindly. "Yes," Grace agreed. "You came from where?" "Ohio." Mrs. Henley was quiet for a moment, looking at Grace with the assessing eyes of a woman who had seen many travelers pass through. "Alone. I started with a wagon master," Grace said. "He died in Kansas." Mrs. Henley set down the bread basket and looked at her more fully. "And you kept going?" "I did. With 4 children." "They were with me," Grace said, which was not quite an answer to the question but was more truthful than any answer could be, because the children had not been a burden she carried alone. They had been part of what kept her moving, the morning voices calling for breakfast, Rose's small hand finding hers in the dark when the prairie storms came at night, Henry's relentless questions about everything they passed, Nora's quiet reading aloud of passages from her journal at the end of each day, Daniel's steadiness at the reins. They had all crossed together. That was the only way to say it properly. "Well," Mrs. Henley said, and seemed to find no other words, and that was fine. Grace did not need words. She needed sleep. In the morning, Clement had the wheel ready by 9 o'clock. He had worked through most of the night, not because it was necessary, but because it had been a long time since he had worked with a specific purpose ticking in his chest, and it was a good feeling, and he had not wanted to lose it by sleeping. The wheel was solid oak with iron banding, better than the one that had broken. He brought the wagon around to the front of his shop and was fitting the wheel when Grace appeared at the end of the street with all 4 children. She had the children lined up and moving with the efficient coordination of a woman who had been managing a small unit of people through difficult country for 2 months. He watched them come down the street. He noticed the way the boy Daniel walked with one hand always available, ready to carry something. He noticed how Nora walked with her nose slightly tilted up, looking at the buildings with the attentive curiosity of someone cataloging everything for later use. He noticed the twins matching each other stride for stride without appearing to try. And he noticed Grace herself, who walked with a straightness of posture that could not be accounted for simply by physical health. It was something chosen. It was what a person looked like when they had decided, a long time ago, that the world was not going to make them fold. She came to where he was working and looked at the new wheel. "That is better than what I had," she said. "The original was worn through," he said. "This will hold you to Sacramento and back again if need be." "There will be no back again," she said simply. He glanced up at her. There was no bitterness in the statement, only a practical finality. This was a woman who had made her calculation and was committed to it. He helped load the wagon. He did not ask to help. He simply began doing it, and after a moment Grace did not protest. The children helped too, the twins carrying things with a seriousness that was, in a 6-year-old, both charming and a little heartbreaking. Daniel managed the heavier items with a competence that spoke of practice. When it was loaded, Grace paid him his fee. She counted out the coins with the precise care of someone who knew exactly what they had and what they could spend. "Thank you," she said, "for the wheel and for the work you put into it." "How did you know I put extra work into it?" he asked. She looked at the wheel, then at him. Because I know what a wheel costs and what you charged me, and the difference tells its own story. A corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one. I have been doing mathematics on this journey for 2 months, Mr. Sullivan. I have become quite good at it. He found himself smiling. It was a real smile, not the polite variety. You are welcome, Mrs. Gentry. She was about to climb up to the wagon seat when he said, without quite planning to say it, there is a better route to Sacramento than the main trail from here. The North Road adds 2 days but avoids the summit crossing in July. The summit floods can come late in the season, and they are not a risk worth taking with a wagon this loaded. She stopped and looked at him. How do you know the summit road? I came through it in the wrong season 6 years ago, he said. I spent 4 days wading out floodwater with a broken cart and a bad-tempered mule. I would not recommend it to anyone. She held his gaze for a moment. Tell me the North Road, she said. He described it, and she listened without writing anything down, but he could see her memorizing it, the way she had looked at the map the night before through the boarding house window which faced his shop. She asked 2 clarifying questions, precise and practical, and then she nodded. Thank you, she said. That is useful. She climbed up to the wagon seat. Daniel sat beside her with the reins already in his hands, and she looked down at Clement one more time. You are a good man, Mr. Sullivan, she said. I hope Millhaven knows it. Then she took the reins herself and clicked to Abraham, and the wagon began to move. Clement stood in the street and watched the wagon until it turned north at the end of town and disappeared between the low hills. He was aware that something had just passed through his life in the way a clean wind passes through a room, leaving the air different, better, but already going. He went back into his shop. He picked up his hammer. He set it down again. He walked to Mrs. Henley's and ate breakfast, which was unusual for him at this hour, and Mrs. Henley said nothing but brought him extra coffee, which was her way of acknowledging that something had changed in the air. That afternoon, Clement found himself thinking about the North Road. He knew it better than he had described. He knew that there was a stretch about 40 miles out where the creek crossing was deceptive, where the water looked shallow but had a stony bottom that could catch a wheel axle if you took it straight. You had to angle upstream 20 yards and then cross diagonally. He had not told her that part. He had not known he was going to need to tell her anything, because he had not been planning to go after her. He was not planning to go after her. He sat in his shop and looked at the unfinished gate hinge, and was honest with himself in the way he was always honest with himself, which was one of the things he considered a personal standard. He thought about the handshake and the direct eyes, and the way she had said you are a good man in the same tone she might use to say the water is clear, as a plain statement of observed fact, without sentiment or agenda. He thought about Daniel at the reins and the twins with their tin pot and cloth bundle and Nora with her journal. He thought about Ohio and a dead wagon master and a Winchester rifle and 2 months of plains alone. He was on the North Road by 4 o'clock. He told himself it was because of the creek crossing, which was not entirely a lie. He found the wagon at the first campsite, 7 miles out, which was the sensible place to stop given the hour of their departure. They had made a neat camp, fire going, Abraham well tethered and eating, the children in their various occupations around the fire. He came in at a distance so the horse would announce him, and he let Abraham hear him first, and then he called out before approaching because a woman traveling alone with 4 children did not need surprises in the dusk. Mrs. Gentry. He saw her hand go to where the Winchester would be before she recognized him. He had no quarrel with that reflex. She stood up from the fire. Mr. Sullivan. Her voice was even, but he thought he saw a flicker of something, relief or surprise or both, before she arranged her expression back to its accustomed composure. Is something wrong with the wheel? The wheel is fine, he said. I forgot to tell you something about the creek crossing at mile 42 on the North Road. She looked at him for a long moment. The fire threw gold light across her face. You rode 7 miles to tell me something about a creek crossing, she said. He felt mildly foolish. He recognized, a man who had just committed an act of transparency that most men in his position would have dressed up in better packaging. He was not going to dress it up. "I did," he said, "and also because it seemed like the right thing to do, and I have found that when something seems like the right thing to do, it usually is." She studied him. The twins had come to stand behind her, one on each side, watching him with the combined, focused attention of children who are very good at reading whether something is a threat. He must have passed that assessment because after a moment Rose came forward and said, "Are you the man who fixed our wheel?" "I am," he said. "It is a very good wheel," Rose said with the gravity of an expert opinion. "Thank you," he said. Henry came forward then too. "Do you want to eat with us? Mother made a good stew." Grace put a hand on Henry's shoulder, a brief touch that was its own kind of communication. "Mr. Sullivan may have to get back to town," she said, looking at Clement. "I do not have to get back to town until morning," he said. Then, because honesty was apparently his mode tonight, he added, "I brought my bedroll. I thought I might camp nearby if that was agreeable to you. It is safe country between here and the creek, but it is not bad to have another pair of eyes at night." She looked at him steadily. He did not look away. There was a kind of quiet negotiation in the look, a reading of intention and character, and he submitted to it without discomfort because he had nothing to hide. "You can sleep on the other side of the fire," she said. "And you will have to eat my stew and listen to Henry's questions about everything, because he will ask them regardless, and I have run out of answers about blacksmithing." "I can answer questions about blacksmithing," he said. "Then you are immediately useful," she said. "Come and eat." Henry's questions about blacksmithing were extensive and detailed, and went on through 2 bowls of stew and well into the evening. Clement answered all of them. Daniel listened from across the fire with the measuring look of a boy deciding what he thought about a man, which Clement recognized and did not rush. Nora wrote steadily in her journal and occasionally glanced up at him with eyes that had her mother's quality of focused attention. Rose fell asleep against Grace's side before the fire had burned halfway down. Grace said very little through the meal. She ate and tended to Rose and watched Clement with her children the way a person watches a river from a bank, reading the current, noting the depths. He was aware of it and did not perform for it. He was simply himself, because it was the only thing he knew how to be, and it seemed, for the first time in a very long time, like enough. When the children were settled in the wagon, Grace sat on the other side of the fire and looked at him across the coals. "Tell me about Millhaven," she said. "Tell me about the people there." He told her. He told her about the land office and the good water from Sanderson Creek, about Ellis Cooper at the livery who was fair, about Mrs. Henley who was kind, about the school teacher, a young woman named Ada Marsh who had come from Philadelphia the previous year and was by all accounts excellent. He told her about the way the valley filled with tall grass in the spring and turned golden in June. He told her about the winters, which were mild enough, milder than Ohio certainly. "You are describing it as a place where a family might settle," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I suppose I am." She looked at the fire. "My uncle in Sacramento is expecting us." "How long has he been expecting you?" She looked up. "Since March, 2 letters ahead of us." "He will have had no news since then," Clement said. "No," she said, "he does not know about the wagon master. No, he does not know you crossed alone." She was quiet. The fire popped. An owl moved somewhere in the dark hills behind them. "Nobody knows that except the people who were there," she said, and her voice had a quality he had not heard in it before, a tiredness that was not physical. "And the people who were there are my children, who were very brave and very good, and who I have protected from knowing how frightened I was." It was the first time she had said anything about fear, and the saying of it changed the air between them in a way that was not uncomfortable but was very real. "Were you frightened often?" he asked. She looked at him directly. "Every single day," she said. "Twice on bad days. Once in the middle of the night when Henry had a fever for 3 days in Colorado, and I did not know if the next town was 10 miles or 40 miles, and the roads were soft and Abraham was limping, and I sat up through the second night listening to Henry breathe and making promises to God that I had no right to make. But Henry is here, Clement said. Henry is here, she agreed. The fever broke on the third morning. He sat up and asked for breakfast, and the world came back into focus. She paused. That is when I knew we were going to make it all the way. Clement looked at her across the fire. The gold light was steady on her face, and she was not looking at him now but at the coals, and she had the expression of someone who has been carrying a weight for so long that they have forgotten what it would feel like to set it down. "You did a remarkable thing," he said. She turned her head and looked at him, and there was a swift flash of something in her eyes, not anger exactly, but a close relative. "I did what was necessary," she said. "Yes," he said. "That is what makes it remarkable." She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at the fire, and after a while she said quietly, "Thank you for that." They sat in companionable silence for a while. The fire burned down to red coals. The night was warm and full of cricket sound, and the hills were dark shapes against a sky that was absolutely full of stars, the kind of sky you only get when you are far enough from any town that the light does not reach it. "What brought you to Millhaven?" she asked. "A friend," he said. "Patrick Doyle. We grew up together in Virginia. He had an idea about land in Nevada, and I had no particular reason to stay where I was, so I came with him." He was quiet. "He died 4 years ago." She looked at him. "I am sorry." "He was a good man," Clement said. "Reckless but good. He walked into a field without checking the grass. He did not need to say more." She understood. Everyone in this country understood, and you stayed. "I had built the shop by then. I had a life." He paused. "It is a good life. It is quiet, but it is good." "Quiet is not a bad thing," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not." She rose and said good night and went to the wagon. Clement lay back on his bedroll and looked at the stars and thought about Sacramento and the distance still between this campfire and it. And he was aware of a feeling he had not expected and had not asked for, a feeling in the chest that was something like wanting, but patient, the kind of wanting that knows it cannot push. In the morning he showed her the creek crossing. He waded in himself to demonstrate the angle, the water cold at the knees in the early summer morning, pointing to the diagonal line that would keep the axle clear of the stony bottom. She watched him, then nodded, then drove the wagon through exactly on the line he had described while he walked alongside, and Abraham trusted her voice more than the water. They made it through without incident. "There," she said from the far bank. "That is what the information was worth 7 miles and a bowl of stew." He smiled. He was in the water to his thighs. She looked down at him from the wagon seat. "You are going to ride wet to Millhaven," she said. "I have been wet before," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and then she did something he had not yet seen her do fully. She laughed. It was a real laugh, brief and surprised, and it transformed her face in the way that real laughter always does, opening something that the composed expression kept closed, and Clement, standing in the cold water of the creek at 6 in the morning with his trousers wet to the hip, thought that he was, without any question, in serious trouble. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan," she said, "for the wheel and the creek and the company." "Safe travel, Mrs. Gentry," he said. She clicked to Abraham. The wagon moved. The twins waved at him from the back, and Nora raised a hand without looking up from her journal, and Daniel gave him a brief nod that had something of a salute in it, and Grace did not look back, which he supposed was correct, because she was looking forward, which was what she did, which was who she was. He stood on the bank until the wagon was over the next rise and gone. Then he mounted his horse and rode back toward Millhaven, and he thought about Sacramento, and he thought about the uncle's land, and he thought about the fact that Grace Gentry had said nobody knows that except the people who were there, and the sadness in her voice when she said it, the loneliness of carrying something extraordinary through a world that had not witnessed it. He had witnessed it, even if only the last 2 miles of it. He had seen enough to understand what the previous 2 months must have been. He thought about it for 3 weeks. He thought about it while he was working, and while he was eating, and while he was lying awake at night. He thought about Daniel's measuring look, which had eventually softened into something like acceptance. He thought about Henry's questions and Rose's expert opinion on wheel quality and Nora's journal pressed to her chest. He thought about the stew, which had been genuinely good, made from very little. He thought about the creek and the cold water and the laugh. He sat down in the 4th week and wrote a letter. He had never written a letter that took him 4 drafts in his life, and this one took 6. The first 3 were too formal. The 4th was too informal and alarmed him with its transparency. The 5th said most of what needed to be said but was too long. The 6th was this. Dear Mrs. Gentry, I hope this letter finds you and your children well, and that the North Road served you as I intended. I have been thinking about your journey and about the things we discussed by the fire, and I find that I would like to know how the story ends. If Sacramento is everything your uncle's letters promised, then I am glad for you. If it is not, I hope you will write and tell me, because I have found that I am a person with a considerable amount of space in both my shop and my conversation, and I suspect your children would find Millhaven instructive. I am not a man who speaks around things, so I will say plainly that I think about you, and I think that is worth knowing. Yours respectfully, Clement Sullivan, Millhaven, Nevada. He sent it to the address Grace had mentioned, her uncle's name, Harold Gentry, Sacramento. He waited. He repaired a gate. He shod 11 horses. He made a new set of barrel hoops for the general store. He replaced a cracked harness buckle. He went to church on Sunday and sat in his usual pew and listened to the sermon, which was about patience, and thought that God had a sense of humor. The reply came in 6 weeks, which was fast for the mail, and when he saw the handwriting on the envelope, which was dark and exact and slanted slightly to the right, he went up to his rooms above the shop to open it alone. Dear Mr. Sullivan, Sacramento is not what the letters promised, but it is not without its merits. My uncle is a kind man, but his land is smaller than his letters suggested, and his wife is unwell, which has changed the nature of what he can offer. I have found work as a seamstress in the short term, and the children are settled, and Daniel has taken to helping my uncle with his work, which has done them both considerable good. I am glad you wrote. I have found that I think about the creek crossing more than seems warranted for a simple river ford. Thank you for saying plainly what you said. It is a quality I value highly. I will write again if that is acceptable. Yours, Grace Gentry. He read it twice. Then he sat with it for a while. Then he went downstairs and worked with a lightness in his chest that he had not felt since before Patrick Doyle died. They wrote back and forth through July and August. Her letters were like her speech, clear and direct, and carrying more than the words themselves, the way a well-made thing carries the character of its maker. She described Sacramento with a journalist's precision, the waterfront smells, the way the hills looked at dusk, the school the children attended, the way Rose had already made 4 friends and Henry was building something in the yard that he described as an engineering project. She described Nora's teacher, who had told her Nora was the best reader in the class, which Grace had received with a composure that she said lasted until she reached the street outside the schoolhouse. She described Daniel, who had turned 13 in July and who had quietly taken on the responsibility of walking his younger siblings to school each morning without being asked. He wrote back about Millhaven. He described the valley at the height of summer, the way the hills went amber and rose in the late afternoon light. He described the creek, and the way it ran clear after the spring floods had settled. He described the school, which had a new term beginning in September under Ada Marsh, who was excellent. He described the space in his shop and the rooms above it, and he did not need to make the implication clear, because Grace Gentry was not a woman who required things spelled out twice. In September she wrote, I believe we should have a conversation that letters are not adequate for. If you are of the same mind, I would hear your thoughts on the matter. He sent back, I will come to Sacramento in October if you will have me. She sent back, I will have you. He left Millhaven on the 2nd of October 1873 with a clean suit he had acquired from the tailor in the next town, and a nervousness that was entirely foreign to his character, and entirely beyond his control. He had told Mrs. Henley he would be gone 2 weeks. Mrs. Henley had looked at him with the expression of a woman who already knows everything and said, "Come back with good news," and he had said he would try. He arrived in Sacramento on the 7th of October. He had her uncle's address. He found the house, which was a modest wooden structure on a side street with a small yard, and he knocked on the door in the early afternoon, and he heard footsteps, and then the door opened and it was Rose. Rose looked at him for exactly 1 second and then said, "It is the wheelman," and turned and called into the house at full volume, "Mother, the wheelman is here." He heard a pause from inside the house, and then Grace came to the door. She was not wearing her trail dress. She was wearing a dark green dress that he had not seen before, and her hair was not in the trail bonnet but pinned up the way he remembered it from the campfire, and she looked at him in the doorway with those clear dark eyes and said, "Mr. Sullivan, you came." "I said I would," he said. "You did," she agreed, and she opened the door wider and stepped back to let him in. He met the uncle, Harold Gentry, who was a thin man of 60 with kind eyes and a careful handshake, and he met Harold's wife Margaret, who was unwell as Grace had described but alert and warm. And he sat in the small parlor and drank coffee and answered Harold's careful questions about his work and his means and his intentions, which were the questions a father would ask, and which Harold had clearly decided fell to him in the absence of any other qualified person. Clement answered them honestly and without resentment because they were the right questions. He was given a room at a boarding house 2 streets away. He spent 4 days in Sacramento. On the first day, he walked through the city with Grace and the 4 children, who showed him their school and the waterfront and the market street. And he paid attention to all of it because the children were pointing things out to him and they deserved attention. But he was also walking beside Grace, and the particular quality of walking beside her, the exact matching of pace, the easy way she spoke to him, the fact that she did not fill silence unnecessarily, but when she spoke it was worth hearing, all of it confirmed what he had understood since the campfire. On the second day, the children were at school and Harold and Margaret were resting, and Grace walked with him to a small park near the river where there were benches under oak trees in the October afternoon. They sat and she looked at the river and he looked at her profile, which was composed and clean-lined, and then she looked at him and said, "What is it you want to say?" He took a breath. He had thought about how to say this for 6 weeks. "I want to say that I am 34 years old and I have been very good at being alone," he said, "and I have not minded it until now, and I mind it now quite specifically because of you. I want to say that I came to Sacramento because of a letter, but I came to the campfire because of something I do not have a precise word for. I want to say that I think your children are extraordinary and that I believe a great deal of that is your doing." He paused. "I want to say that I would like the opportunity to know you better, and I am hoping you will tell me whether that is a thing you want as well, and if you do, I would very much like to discuss what that might look like." She was looking at him through all of this with that reading expression, the river-watching look, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment. "I have been a widow for less than a year," she said. "I know," he said. "I loved my husband," she said. "He was a good man and his death was fast and unfair and I was not prepared for it." "I know," he said. "I also know that I am 31 years old and I have 4 children and I have not come all this way to be afraid of a good thing," she said. "I have been afraid enough on this journey." She looked at him steadily. "I want to know you better. I have wanted to know you better since you stood in a creek in your trouser legs at 6 in the morning to show me how to cross safely." She paused, and the corner of her mouth moved again. "That is not a sentence I expected to be true, but there it is." He looked at her. The oak trees were moving in the October wind, and the river was bright in the afternoon light, and he was aware of a happiness that was quiet and solid, not the bright, brief kind, but the kind that settles in and stays. "There it is," he agreed. They talked for 2 hours on that bench. They talked about Thomas, and she told him the truth of it, the fever and the debt and the decision, and he listened without trying to fix or minimize any of it. They talked about Patrick Doyle, and he told her about growing up in Virginia and the particular companionship of having known a person since childhood and the particular silence that followed losing them. They talked about what Millhaven was and what it could be. They talked about the school and the creek and the shop and the rooms above it. He asked her what she needed before she could say yes to anything. She said, "I need to know that Daniel will be respected. He is 13 and he carries himself like a man, and he does not need to be treated like a child, but he is still a child." "I understand," he said. "I need to know that the children will have a stable place," she said. "They have been moving and uncertain for long enough." "I understand that too," he said. "And I need to know," she said more slowly, "that you understand what you are taking on. 4 children are not a small thing. They are the most important thing." "They are," he said, "and I am not a man who sees them as anything other than that." She looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said slowly, "I do not believe you are." On the 3rd day he took Daniel fishing on the river. He had brought a simple rod and line from Sacramento's Market Street, and they sat on the bank in the morning and fished without much speaking, and after a while Daniel said, without looking at him, "My mother is happy when she talks about you." Clement said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" Daniel considered this with the deliberateness of a 13-year-old who takes questions seriously. "She was not happy for a long time," he said. "Not since my father died. She was determined, which is not the same thing." He paused. "So it is a good thing, but she does not need anyone to make decisions for her." "I know that," Clement said. Daniel looked at him sidelong. "She made every decision on the plains herself, every single one. She decided when we moved and when we stopped and which road and how long. She never made a wrong one." "I know," Clement said. "I have been trying to figure out the right word for what she did for several months." Daniel looked back at the water. "Remarkable," he said, with the certainty of someone who has been sitting with a word for a long time and has finally decided it is the right one. "That is the word." "Yes," Clement said, "that is exactly the word." They fished in companionable quiet for another hour. Daniel caught 2 fish. Clement caught 1. They carried them back for dinner, and Harold's wife Margaret was well enough to come to the table that evening, and Grace cooked the fish with herbs from Harold's small garden, and Henry explained the principles of his engineering project to Clement in such thorough detail that Nora, who had heard it 3 times already, retreated to her journal, and Rose fell asleep in her chair at the table, and Harold told a story about California in the early days that had everyone laughing. And Margaret held Harold's hand on the table, and Clement sat across from Grace and caught her looking at him with an expression that he filed away to keep, the way you keep a particular stone or a particular letter, because it was the kind of thing worth keeping. On the 4th day, in the morning, he asked her to come back to Millhaven. He asked her formally and without hesitation in the small parlor of Harold's house, with the autumn light coming through the window, and he told her what he had told her on the bench, and he told her what he had told her in the letters, and then he said something he had not said before, which was that he had stood in his shop every morning for 3 weeks after her wagon went over the rise and felt the presence of something he had not been looking for but could not now imagine being without. She stood in the morning light and looked at him and said, "It is a long way back to Millhaven from Sacramento." "It is," he said, "but you have been known to make long journeys." She laughed, and it was the same real laugh as at the creek, brief and surprised and opening, and it confirmed everything. "I will need to settle Harold and Margaret properly before I leave," she said. "I cannot leave Margaret without help. She needs a woman nearby." "I understand," he said. "Take the time you need." "There is also the matter of what you are asking," she said, and her voice was direct in the way it always was. "Are you asking me to come to Millhaven as a woman who is keeping company? Or are you asking me something more specific?" He met her eyes. "I am asking you to come to Millhaven and marry me," he said, "if you will, and if you would prefer to keep company first and decide later, I will honor that, but I want to say what I mean because I have found it is the only way I know how to speak." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I will need some time." "Of course," he said. "Not very much time," she added. "I am not a person who requires a great deal of time to make a decision when I already know the shape of it." He looked at her. "And what is the shape of it?" She looked back at him with those clear dark eyes, and something in them settled like water going still. "The shape of it is yes," she said. "But I want to say it properly when I am ready, and not in a front parlor with 4 children potentially listening through the wall." From the hallway, unmistakably, there was the sound of the twins trying not to laugh. Grace turned toward the hallway and said, at normal volume, "Henry, Rose, go and find something to do in the yard." There were rapid, retreating footsteps and a door. Grace looked back at Clement with an expression that was part amusement and part the exasperated love of a mother, and he thought that was also a thing worth keeping. He went back to Millhaven at the end of October. Grace wrote 2 weeks later to say she had found a neighbor woman to look in on Margaret regularly, and that Harold had hired a young man to help with his land, and that the children's school term would finish at the end of November. She wrote that she was going to tell Harold and Margaret about Clement and ask for their blessing, which Harold gave warmly and Margaret gave with instructions that Grace relayed to Clement that he was to take very good care of all 5 of them or Margaret would make the journey herself. Clement wrote back, "Please tell Mrs. Harold Gentry that I intend to do exactly that, and that I look forward to meeting her in better health and circumstances when the time comes." Grace arrived in Millhaven on the 15th of December 1873, with 4 children and 1 wagon and Abraham and the carved oak chest and the cast iron stove that everyone had told her she was a fool to bring. Clement was waiting at the edge of town. He had told no one except Mrs. Henley, who had told approximately everyone. So there was a small gathering of curious Millhaven residents on the main street when the wagon came in, which Grace surveyed with the expression of someone who is mildly surprised and not remotely intimidated. She stopped the wagon next to him. She had the reins. Daniel was beside her as he always was. "You told people," she said. "Mrs. Henley told people," he said. "You told Mrs. Henley." "I did," he admitted. From the wagon, Rose leaned out between the cover panels and looked at the gathered townspeople and said, at a volume clearly audible to the nearest dozen residents, "This is Millhaven. It is smaller than I expected." There was laughter from the crowd, warm and genuine, and Grace closed her eyes for a moment in the manner of a woman who has made her peace with Rose's personality. Clement said, "Welcome to Millhaven, Mrs. Gentry." She opened her eyes and looked at him, and the corner of her mouth moved. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, "you had better show us where we are staying." He had arranged rooms at Mrs. Henley's for the children while work was done on the rooms above the shop, which needed expansion. Mrs. Henley received them all with the warm efficiency of a woman in her element, and the children were fed and settled before dinner. That evening Clement and Grace sat in Mrs. Henley's small parlor after the children were asleep, and it was the first time they had been alone since the bench by the river in Sacramento, and the time and the letters had done their work, because it was different now, easier and deeper at once. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask," he said. "What did you think when you saw me coming down the street with the broken wagon? What was your first thought?" He considered this seriously because she asked seriously. "My first thought was about the wheel," he said. "My second thought was about the horse. My third thought," he paused, "was that I was looking at someone who had decided something that most people never decide." She raised her eyebrows slightly. "That they were not going to be stopped," he said. She was quiet. "And that was remarkable to you," she said, remembering his word from the campfire. "It was the most remarkable thing I had ever witnessed," he said, and meant it with the full weight of 34 years of witnessing things. "I have seen courage. I have seen stubbornness. I have seen determination. But what you did, alone with 4 children, across the plains, without a guide, without a party, without any certainty about what you would find, and to arrive the way you arrived, not broken, not diminished, not asking for anything except a wheel and a fair price, that is not a common thing. That is not a small thing. She looked at him for a long time, and when she spoke her voice was slightly unsteady for the first time since he had known her. "I was very frightened," she said. "I was frightened every day." "I know," he said. "You told me. That is also part of what makes it remarkable. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is what you did with it." She looked down at her hands, and then she said, very quietly, "No one has ever said that to me. Everyone in Ohio when I left thought I was reckless or foolish. The travelers we passed thought I was unfortunate. My children thought I was invincible, which I allowed because they needed to believe it." "And what did you think you were?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Determined," she said. "Necessary, responsible. All of those," he said, "and remarkable." She looked up at him, and there was something in her face that he had not seen before, something younger and more open, the face underneath the trail face, the one that had been protected behind the composure for a very long time. "Yes," she said after a moment. "All right." He reached across the small distance between their chairs and took her hand. Her hand was as it had been on the handshake, capable and direct, and she turned it in his and held on. "I am glad you stopped in Millhaven," he said. "I had a broken wheel," she said. "Yes," he said, "you did," and he was smiling. "And you were the blacksmith," she said. "I was. And you had a perfectly good wheel." "I did." She looked at him with those clear dark eyes and a warmth in them that was fully present now, not behind any glass. "Then I suppose I was fortunate in my wheel," she said. "I suppose you were," he said. They were married in January 1874 in the small church in Millhaven with the cracked bell that rang imperfectly and was therefore entirely suited to a real and human occasion. Ada Marsh, the schoolteacher, stood up with Grace. Ellis Cooper from the livery stood up with Clement. Mrs. Henley cried with the frank enthusiasm of a woman who had been waiting for this for 6 months. Harold and Margaret made the journey from Sacramento, Margaret in better health than Grace had dared hope, and she sat in the front pew and held Harold's arm and looked at Grace with an expression that said everything about what she thought of this outcome. Daniel stood straight and solemn during the ceremony and shook Clement's hand afterward with a grip that was already a man's grip, and looked him in the eye for a long moment and then said, quietly, "Take care of her." And Clement said, "I will. We'll take care of each other." And Daniel had nodded once, accepting the revision, because he was old enough to understand that it was the better version. Nora wrote approximately 4 pages in her journal that evening. Henry fell in a mud puddle outside the church and was cleaned up by Rose, who took charge of this event with the calm efficiency of a person accustomed to managing crises, and the dress she was wearing was only slightly damaged. Rose, standing in the church in her slightly mud-splattered dress, told anyone who would listen that she had known since the creek crossing that this was going to happen, because she had very good instincts for these things, and nobody strongly contradicted her. The first 6 months of Clement and Grace's married life had the quality of 2 people discovering that their private calculations about each other were, largely, correct. He was steady and quiet and capable and genuinely funny in the dry, understated way of men who choose their words carefully. She was direct and warm and deeply competent in the ways that mattered, and she had a laugh that was worth waiting for. They worked well beside each other, which is not always a given and is, in its own way, its own kind of love. Clement expanded the rooms above the shop in February and March, adding 2 bedrooms and a proper kitchen, and he did the work himself with help from Daniel, who was turning into a serious and capable young man with a keen interest in how things were built. They spent many Saturdays working side by side, and Grace would bring them lunch and Clement would look up and see Grace in the doorway with the food, and sometimes she would be watching them both with an expression so full and quiet that it made him set down his tools for a moment. Nora enrolled fully in Ada Marsh's school and bloomed there in the way of children who have finally been given the exact right environment, turning out compositions that Ada brought to Grace with barely concealed excitement. Henry's engineering project, transported from Sacramento, was reassembled in the yard behind the shop, and turned out to be a working model of a bridge that was actually structurally sound, which caused considerable interest among the adults who saw it. Rose made friends with approximately every child in Millhaven within 30 days of arriving, and was in the middle of every social event in the under 10 population of the town by spring. The valley in spring was, as Clement had promised, extraordinary. The hills went green and the creek ran high and the grass came in tall and pale, and Grace stood in the door of the shop on a March morning and looked at it and said, to no one in particular, "It is very beautiful," and Clement, who was behind her, said, "Yes," and was not looking at the hills. She turned and caught him, and the expression on her face was entirely pleased. "You are not even looking," she said. "I am looking at something," he said. She turned back to the hills with the expression of a woman who is trying and failing to fully suppress a smile. The spring also brought the first real difficulty. There was a man in Millhaven named Arthur Galt, who had come from Missouri the previous year, and had been quietly investing in land in the valley through means that were, upon scrutiny, not entirely legitimate. He had been in conversation with the land office about a claim that butted up against the parcel that Clement owned behind the shop, and Galt had produced a deed that had some irregularities in its date that Ellis Cooper, of all people, noticed when he happened to see the document in the land office. Clement took the matter to the land office himself and laid out the irregularities with the measured thoroughness he brought to all things. The land agent, a man named Fuller, reviewed the documents over 2 days and determined that Galt's deed was fabricated in at least 3 respects and ruled against him. Galt left Millhaven shortly after with bad grace and a colorful assessment of Fuller's character that most people in town took as confirmation that the ruling was just. Grace had watched this process with the focused attention she brought to all things and said, afterward, "You handled that very calmly." "There was no need to be other than calm," he said. "The truth was in the documents. Men who deal in fabricated deeds do not always accept the truth from documents without argument," she said. "No," he agreed. But Galt did not have a strong hand, and he knew it. She looked at him. "You are not a man who is often afraid, are you?" He thought about this honestly. "Not in the way of physical things, no," he said. "I have been afraid of losses, of Patrick, of—" he paused, "of you for a while after the wagon went over the hill." She looked at him very steadily. "Afraid of losing me," she said, "when you had only known me a day." "Yes," he said. "I was surprised by it too." She came across the room and stood in front of him and put her hand against his chest, which was something she did sometimes. A simple placement of her hand, palm flat, as if checking that something was still there and solid. "I was not going to be lost," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I did not know that yet." She looked up at him and her eyes were warm and direct. "You know it now," she said. "I know it now," he said. He put his hand over hers on his chest, and they stood like that for a moment in the room above the blacksmith shop in Millhaven, Nevada, in the spring of 1874. And that moment was the kind of thing that does not need to be described in great detail to be understood, because it was simple and true and entirely sufficient. Summer came and the valley went amber as promised, and Grace took to the rhythms of Millhaven with the same purposeful adaptability she had taken to everything. She began sewing for the town's women, not just for income, but because she was genuinely excellent at it, with an eye for line and proportion that made her work better than what most women in the territory could get from a catalog. She became friends with Ada Marsh, who came to dinner on Tuesdays and talked books with Nora and asked Clement questions about metallurgy that she was storing for future school lessons. Daniel turned 14 in July and began working half-days in the shop with Clement, learning the trade with the same focused seriousness he brought to everything. And Clement took his teaching of the boy with the same care he brought to the wheel, making sure it was done properly and well, without shortcuts, because Daniel deserved that. One evening in August, Grace and Clement sat on the steps of the shop in the warm dusk, the valley going gold around them and the creek audible in the distance, and Grace was quiet in the way that was different from her usual quiet, more interior. He waited. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I have been thinking about what you said in January, about remarkable." She paused. "I have been thinking about it for months, and I could not understand why it struck me the way it did." He waited. "I think it is because no one had ever recognized it as a choice," she said. "The crossing, everyone else saw it as something that happened to me. An unfortunate circumstance, a widow, a difficulty. Even the people who were kind about it framed it as something I endured." She paused. "You said it was remarkable. Not unfortunate, not brave in the sense of someone who has no choice, but remarkable, as if I had made a decision that mattered, as if it was something." He turned to look at her. "It was something," he said. "I know," she said, and her voice was steadier than he expected. "I know it now. I think I knew it on the plains, but there was no one to say it back to me, and so it lived only inside me, and it was, sometimes, very hard to keep it alive alone." He reached across and took her hand. "You do not have to keep anything alive alone anymore," he said. She looked at him, and her eyes were bright, not with tears exactly, but with the clear, luminous quality of deep feeling looked at directly. "No," she said, "I do not." The evening settled around them. Somewhere down the street, Henry was explaining something to Rose with great conviction, and Rose was responding with her usual blend of practical skepticism. Nora's window was lit with candlelight, which meant she was writing. Daniel was in the shop below, closing up the tools for the evening, and they could hear the careful, methodical sounds of it. "I am very glad my wheel broke in Millhaven," Grace said. "So am I," he said. "Every day I am glad." She leaned against his shoulder, and they sat in the August dusk, and the valley was golden around them. And it was exactly the life they had arrived at from entirely different directions and found, to their mutual surprise and permanent gratitude, fit them precisely. The following spring, in March of 1875, Grace told Clement she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the early morning before the children were up. In the direct way she told him all important things, standing at the table and looking at him with steady eyes and a composure that barely contained, he could see, a deep and private joy. He looked at her for a moment, and then he crossed the kitchen and took her face in both his hands and kissed her forehead, her temple, her cheek, and she laughed, the real laugh, surprised and opening, and he said against her hair, "That is the best news I have received in my life." "Better than the letter that said yes?" she asked. "Equal," he said. "Equal to that." She pulled back to look at him, and she was smiling fully now. No corner of the mouth, no almost, the full thing, and she said, "A boy or a girl, what do you think?" "A boy," he said, because he had a feeling, and he had found that he trusted his feelings about things. "What will we call him?" she said. He thought for a moment. "Daniel will want to say," he said, "and Nora will want to say, and Henry and Rose will each want the final say, which will create a conflict." She laughed again. "They will," she agreed. "We should name him before we tell them." They settled on the name together over breakfast, just the two of them, while the household slept around them. They settled on James Patrick Sullivan, James for Grace's father and Patrick for Clement's oldest friend. And when they said the name out loud, it sounded right in the way that right names do, as if the child had already chosen it and was simply waiting for them to catch up. When they told the children that evening, the response was exactly as predicted. Daniel nodded with a measured pleasure that was his signature. Nora immediately began writing in her journal. Henry announced that the child would need to be taught engineering as early as possible. Rose declared that she would teach the baby everything it needed to know, which was the most comprehensive offer on the table. Daniel, catching Clement's eye, allowed himself a small smile, the private smile of someone who has watched a good thing come together and is satisfied by it. Grace's pregnancy was largely uncomplicated. Dr. Hennessy, who had set up a practice in Millhaven in the early part of 1875, said she was in excellent health, which surprised no one who knew her. She continued sewing and managing the household, and being the practical center of Millhaven's domestic social fabric until the final weeks, when Clement enforced a reduction in activity, with a gentle but absolute firmness that she resisted, and then submitted to with the pragmatism of a woman who understood when an argument was correct even if it was inconvenient. James Patrick Sullivan was born in the first week of November 1875, a boy as Clement had predicted, sturdy and loud and full of opinion from the first moments, which seemed appropriate given his parentage. He had Grace's dark eyes and Clement's darker hair, and a temperament that was already becoming clear as bright, interested, and impatient with the pace of the world. The day James was born, Clement sat in the chair beside the bed where Grace lay with the baby, and looked at the two of them and felt something that did not have a name in any vocabulary he knew, something that was gratitude and love and awe at the specific fact of this particular life, and this particular woman, and this particular child in this particular room in Millhaven, Nevada, in the autumn of 1875. Grace was looking at the baby. She looked up at Clement, and her face had the fullness he had come to love in it, the unguarded version, the one that only appeared when she was past composure into something truer. "James Patrick," she said, trying the name. "James Patrick," he agreed. The baby opened his eyes and appeared to consider his circumstances. "He looks unconvinced," Grace said. "He will come around," Clement said. She laughed softly, and the baby startled slightly and then subsided, and Clement reached out and took Grace's free hand, and the three of them were in that quiet room with the November wind against the window and the lamp burning low and everything else. The shop and the children and the valley and the whole difficult and beautiful road that had brought them here was on the other side of the door, held at a respectful distance by the completeness of this moment. Daniel was the first one in. He knocked, which was typical, and stood in the doorway looking at the baby with an expression that moved very quickly through surprise into something much softer, something young and unguarded that he would have been mortified to have anyone describe. "There he is," Clement said. Daniel came forward carefully and looked at James in the way of someone looking at something they did not know they wanted until they saw it. "James," he said, trying it out. James opened his eyes again and appeared to find Daniel satisfactory. "He looks at people directly," Daniel said, "like mother." "Yes," Clement said, "he does." Nora came in behind Daniel with her journal, which she had clearly already begun writing in, and then Henry, who immediately began asking Dr. Hennessy questions about the biology of the situation with the thoroughness of someone who intended to understand it completely, and Rose, who came in last and went straight to the baby with the absolute calm confidence of someone who had already decided they were responsible for this person's entire education, and said, "Hello, James. I am Rose. I am going to teach you everything." Grace looked at Clement over the heads of her assembled children, with the baby in her arms and the lamp burning warm and the Nevada wind outside, and her expression was the one he kept in the permanent and well-maintained collection of things worth keeping, an expression made of love and exhaustion and humor, and a deep and unassailable peace. He held her gaze for a moment, and then he looked at the children, all five of them now, and then at the window where the light was the amber gold of an autumn evening in the valley that had turned out to be exactly what he had described and more. And he thought about a wagon with a broken wheel, and a woman who walked beside her horse talking to him in a low voice, and a creek crossing at 6 in the morning, and a campfire and a letter and a bench by a river in Sacramento. And all the ordinary decisions that had added up to this specific room and these specific people. "Well," Henry said to James with great seriousness, "I should tell you about engineering." "Henry," Grace said. "He will need to know," Henry said. "Not tonight," Grace said, with the particular firmness that was entirely loving and entirely final. Henry subsided with the expression of someone who is postponing rather than abandoning. The months that followed were full in the way of good and busy lives, the kind of fullness that is made not of grand events but of accumulated ordinary moments that are, in the looking back, anything but ordinary. Clement's shop grew. He hired a young man named Will Perkins who had come through Millhaven on his way somewhere else and had stayed because, as he told Clement, the The work was honest and the valley was beautiful, and he couldn't think of a good reason to keep moving. Daniel worked with Clement most afternoons now and was developing a real skill, his hands learning the language of iron and fire with the natural aptitude of someone who has the patience and the precision the work requires. Clement watched this with a quiet satisfaction that was entirely unperformed. Nora won an essay competition that Ada Marsh had organized for all the Nevada Territory schools, and her essay, about the journey from Ohio to Millhaven, was read aloud at a gathering in the church. Grace sat in the pew and listened to Nora's careful, precise, 12-year-old account of the river crossings and the Kansas mud and the Colorado fever and the creek at Millhaven. And Clement, sitting beside Grace, felt her hand find his in the dark of the pew and grip it. The essay described the crossing in Nora's particular voice, factual and clear, without dramatization, which somehow made it more affecting, not less. It described the day the wagon master died and the decision her mother made. It described the nights on the plains, the stars visible from horizon to horizon. It described arriving at Millhaven with the broken wheel, and it ended with a sentence that Clement would not forget. My mother crossed the plains alone because there was no other way to cross them, and she arrived in Millhaven not broken but whole, and that is where we are now, and that is where we will stay. There was a long silence in the church, and then the applause was genuine and sustained, and Nora stood at the front with the composed expression of someone who is very pleased and working very hard not to show it. After the gathering, when people had dispersed and the children had gone ahead with Mrs. Henley, Clement and Grace walked back to the shop in the evening, the valley quiet around them and the creek audible in the distance. "She got it right," he said. "She usually does," Grace said. "She has a true eye." She paused. "She got it from her father." He looked at her. "Thomas had a true eye for things," she said. "He could walk into a room and tell you immediately what was wrong in it and what was right. Nora has that." She paused. "I hope she knows how to use it." "She does," he said. "You can tell." Grace nodded. They walked for a moment in the evening. "Do you think about him often?" Clement asked, not with any shadow in the question, but with the honest openness of a man who knows that the past is part of the present and does not fear it. "Sometimes," she said. "More in the early months, less now. When I see Nora with that essay, yes. When Daniel does something that is exactly like him, yes." She was quiet. "He would have liked you, I think." "I hope so," Clement said. "He valued honest men," she said. "Men who meant what they said and said what they meant." She glanced at him. "You would have been obvious to him." "Obvious," he said. "As a good man," she said. "He would have seen it immediately. He was quick about people." Clement walked for a moment. "I am glad you told me that," he said. "I thought you might like to know," she said. She took his arm as they walked, which was something she did in the evenings now, a comfortable and habitual thing, and the night was warm and the creek was bright in the distance, and the shop was ahead of them with the light in the upstairs windows meaning the children were home, and the lamp was lit. A year after James was born, in the autumn of 1876, Grace told Clement she was expecting again. This time she told him at dinner with the children matter-of-factly, because she had decided that children should not be protected from good news, and the reaction from the assembled table was immediate and characteristic. Daniel said, "Good," with the warmth that lived under his reserve. Nora reached for her journal. Henry demanded to know if it would be a boy or a girl, and when Clement said he thought a girl this time, Rose looked at him with sharp interest. "Will she be like me?" Rose asked. "God willing, no," Henry said. Rose threw a biscuit at him. "That is enough," Grace said without raising her voice, and the biscuit incident concluded. The baby, born in May 1877, was a girl, as Clement had predicted, and they named her Catherine Margaret. Catherine for a gray tan of Clement's, who had been described to him as a woman of formidable character, and Margaret for Harold's wife, whose health had been improving and who was, by this point, one of the most regular correspondents in the Sullivan household. Catherine Margaret Sullivan arrived in the world with dark hair like her father and a remarkable resemblance to her brother James's determined approach to existence, and Rose immediately appointed herself head of the welcome committee, which James, now 18 months old and fully mobile, accepted with the grave tolerance of a person who has learned there is no arguing with Rose. Harold and Margaret visited Millhaven for the first time in the summer of 1877, making the journey from Sacramento with a careful easiness that acknowledged Margaret's improving but still careful health, and they stayed for 3 weeks. Harold walked the valley with Clement and said that Nevada was not what he had expected, by which he meant it was considerably better. Margaret sat in the shade of the shop front with James in her lap and watched the street and said to Grace on the second day, "You are happy," not as a question. "I am," Grace said. "I could tell from the letters," Margaret said, "but it is different to see it." "Is it what you hoped for me?" Grace asked. Margaret looked at her with the direct warmth of a woman who has been paying attention for a long time. "It is better than what I hoped," she said. "I hoped for you to be safe and provided for. This is those things, but it is also more than those things." Grace looked at Clement, who was walking with Harold at the far end of the street, both of them stopping to look at something Clement was pointing out, some feature of the valley or the creek. "Yes," she said, "it is more." In the evenings of Harold and Margaret's visit, the whole household sat on the steps and in the yard, the children at various occupations around them, James exploring the immediate world with the focused intensity of a toddler, Catherine in Clement's arms, Daniel and Harold in conversation about the Sacramento land, Henry explaining something to Margaret who listened with genuine interest, Nora reading, Rose organizing everyone and everything as was her nature. On the last evening before Harold and Margaret left, Harold took Clement aside for a moment, the two men standing in the yard in the dusk, and Harold said, "She came to me broken, you know, not broken in the way she showed. She showed up whole, you know how she does, but I could see it underneath. 8 months a widow, 4 children, 2 months of plains, and she showed up and made dinner for us all the first evening." He paused. "I did not know how to help her. Margaret was unwell. I felt useless to her. She did not need saving," Clement said. "She needed witnessing." Harold looked at him. "Yes," he said after a moment. "Yes, that is exactly right." He extended his hand. "Thank you for that." Clement shook it. "Thank you for the letters that brought her here," he said. Harold laughed. "I suppose I cannot take credit for the broken wheel." "The wheel was its own business," Clement agreed. Harold and Margaret departed the next morning with the warmth of a family well-knit, which was what they were now, the Sacramento branch and the Millhaven branch, connected by letters and visits and the particular love that accumulates between people who have been generous to each other at important moments. By 1878, Millhaven had grown. New families had come in. The land office was open 5 days a week. There was talk of a proper schoolhouse to replace the single room where Ada Marsh had been teaching. A doctor had established a permanent practice. A second general store had opened. The Sanderson Creek Bridge, which had been a planked ford, was rebuilt in wood and iron, and Clement did most of the ironwork on it, and Daniel worked alongside him for the full 3 weeks it took. And when it was finished, Daniel looked at the finished bridge with the expression of someone who has understood something important about what they want to do with their life. Daniel came to Clement on a November evening in 1878 and said he wanted to learn the trade properly, the full apprenticeship, the complete knowledge of ironwork and metalcraft. He was almost 16, serious and capable, and already with the broad-shouldered build of a man who works with his hands. Clement said, "Then I will teach you everything I know." Daniel said, "There is something else." Clement waited. "I will learn from you," Daniel said carefully, "and it will mean working in your shop, and I want to be clear that I understand what that means. It means working for you. It means you are my teacher." He paused. "And it also means you are my father in the way that matters, and I want you to know that I know that." Clement was quiet for a moment. He did not rush past the weight of that because it deserved its full weight. "I am glad you know that," he said, "because it is true." Daniel nodded once, the way he had nodded at the wagon cross on the first morning, with a finality that was also a beginning. Grace was in the kitchen when Clement told her, and she turned from the stove and looked at him for a long moment. And then she said, simply, "Good," and went back to the cooking. But he could see from the set of her shoulders that she was moved. And he thought, as he often thought, that the composed exterior and the deep interior of Grace Sullivan were two of the most perfectly matched things he had ever encountered. The years moved as good years do, with their share of difficulty and their abundance of ordinary days that were, in the living of them, extraordinary. Henry went east for schooling in 1880 at 17, to an engineering college in Ohio of all places, because the circular quality of the geography appealed to his sense of narrative. He wrote long, detailed letters about everything he was learning, and James, who was 5 by then, listened to the letters being read at dinner with the rapturous attention of a boy who had already decided that his older brother was the most interesting person in the world. Nora, at 16 in 1880, began writing for the Millhaven Valley Courier, a small newspaper that had started publication the previous year. Her pieces were sharp and clear-eyed and occasionally caused comment in the community, which Ada Marsh said was the mark of good writing, and Grace agreed. Rose, at 13, had organized approximately half the social events in the under-15 population of Millhaven and was beginning to organize some of the adult ones. She had also, at 13, decided she was going to be a doctor, a decision she delivered at dinner with the finality of a papal decree, and when nobody argued with her she seemed slightly disappointed. "Is anyone going to say it is not possible?" she asked. "Why would we say that?" Grace said. "Because I am a girl," Rose said. Grace looked at her daughter steadily. "I crossed the Kansas plains alone with 4 children and no guide," she said. "You will be a doctor." Rose looked at her for a moment, and then she smiled, the full Rose smile that was identical in candle power to her mother's, and said, "Yes, I will." Catherine, small and dark-haired and with her father's observant quiet, had turned 3 and was in the habit of appearing at Clement's side in the shop and watching him work with the focused attention of someone taking notes. He had begun explaining what he was doing to her in the same way he had explained it to Henry's questions, fully and without condescension, and she listened to all of it with an expression of thorough consideration. One morning in the shop, Catherine stood beside him and said, "I want to do that." He looked at the tool in his hands and then at her and said, "You will have to be bigger." "I know," she said. "I am working on it." He laughed, and Grace, who had appeared in the doorway of the shop, heard it and smiled in the way she smiled at the particular joy of watching Clement with the children, which was its own complete and particular thing. In 1882, 8 years after they had married, Clement and Grace sat on the steps of the shop on an October evening, the same steps where they had sat in the August dusk years before, and the valley was golden around them in the exact way he had described it to her in letters before she had ever seen it. James was 6 and asleep inside. Catherine was 4 and also asleep. Nora was in her room writing. Rose was at a friend's house. Daniel was in the shop, working late on a commission, the sound of his hammer a familiar steady rhythm from below. 8 years, Grace said. 8 years, he agreed. She leaned against his shoulder in the way she did now on evenings, familiar and complete. "I have been thinking about the essay," she said. "Nora's essay, that we arrived in Millhaven and that is where we would stay." "Yes," he said. "She was right," Grace said, "and she did not even know yet that this was where we would stay." "She knew before you did," he said. Grace turned to look at him. "Do you think so?" "She had a true eye," he said. "You said so yourself." Grace looked at him for a moment and then she said, "I want to tell you something that I have never said properly." He waited, as he always waited for her, with the patience that was natural to him, and that she had come to know as one of the permanent and reliable things. "I left Ohio," she said. "I was doing it because I had no choice. I told myself I had a choice, that I was choosing California, choosing the future, choosing to not be beaten by the circumstances. And those things were true." She paused. "But underneath those things I was doing it because if I stopped moving I would have had to sit still with all of it, the debt and the farm and Thomas's clothes still on the peg by the door, and I did not know if I could sit still with all of it and come out the other side. He did not say anything. The plains were hard, she said, but they were also a reason to keep moving. And then the wheel broke in Millhaven, and you came out to the street, and you said that wheel is finished in the plainest possible voice, and something in me relaxed. She paused, not because you were going to fix it, but because you looked at the thing as it was and said it plainly, and I realized I had been surrounded by people who were either pretending things were fine or people who were making them worse, and you just looked at it and said the plain truth, and it was, I think, the first time in 8 months that I felt the world make sense again. He looked at her. The valley was quiet around them. And then you were kind, she said. Precisely kind. Not too much and not too little. You walked the horse to the livery because it was necessary, and you told me the north road because it was useful, and you came to the campfire because it was honest, and all of those things together were, I think, the beginning of my understanding that moving was not the only thing I knew how to do. She looked at him. You are the reason I stopped. He was quiet for a long moment. And you, he said, are the reason I understood what I had been waiting for. She held his gaze in the evening light. We have a remarkable life, she said. We do, he said. Because of a broken wheel, she said. And a good horse, he said. And a blacksmith who told me the plain truth, she said. And a woman, he said, who crossed the plains alone with 4 children and arrived in Millhaven unbroken. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, I was not entirely unbroken. No, he agreed, but you arrived. Yes, she said, I arrived. She put her head against his shoulder, and the evening settled around them. The valley amber and quiet, the creek audible in the distance, Daniel's hammer steady below, and the children sleeping inside, and all the accumulated ordinary, extraordinary days of their life in this valley breathing around them like the tall grass in the wind. And Grace Sullivan, who had crossed the plains alone with 4 children, because there was no other way across them, sat on the steps of her home in Millhaven, Nevada, in the October of 1882, and was still, not stopped, not defeated, not exhausted into stillness, but arrived. Fully and finally arrived at the place that had been waiting for her at the end of the only road she would have taken, through the Kansas mud and the Colorado fever and the creek at 6 in the morning, and the wheel that broke 2 miles outside of a town she had never heard of, where a blacksmith came out to the street and looked at the wheel and told her the plain truth. She had arrived. And that, as Clement Sullivan would tell it for the rest of his life, when asked how he had come to have the life he had, was the most remarkable thing he had ever witnessed. Not the crossing, though the crossing was remarkable. Not the arriving, though the arriving was remarkable. But the woman herself, who had held her children together and held herself together, and held the whole impossible undertaking together from Ohio to Nevada with nothing but determination and love and a Winchester rifle and a horse named Abraham, who arrived not as someone who had merely survived, but as someone who had decided something about the world, and the world had not been able to make her undecided. That, he said, was the most remarkable thing. And Grace, when she heard him say it, which she heard him say several times over the years, in different company and different contexts, always with the same quiet conviction, would look at him from wherever she was in the room with the clear, dark, direct eyes that had first looked at him across a broken wheel on the main street of Millhaven, and her expression would be the one he kept in the permanent and well-maintained collection of things worth keeping, the expression that said, I know. I know that it was, and I know that you know it, and that is the thing. Henry came back from Ohio in 1883 with a degree and a young woman named Clara, who he married the following spring in the Millhaven church, the cracked bell ringing imperfectly as it always did, which was by now a tradition and a source of local affection. Rose finished her schooling in 1885 and began her medical training, and she did in fact become a doctor, the first woman doctor in the Carson Valley, which she announced to the world with the calm certainty of someone who had been told at 13 that it was entirely possible and had simply proceeded on that basis. Nora's writing grew. She published pieces in papers as far east as Denver and eventually in San Francisco, clear-eyed and precise, the true eye at work on the world. She married at 23, a schoolteacher named Robert Marsh who was, as it turned out, Ada Marsh's younger brother, and they settled in Millhaven, and the family remained, as families should, within the sound of each other's lives. Daniel took over half the running of the shop in 1885 when he was 24, and by 1888 his ironwork was known through the territory for its quality and its precision, and he expanded the business into the next building and hired 2 men of his own, and Clement watched this with the specific satisfaction of someone who has passed something on well. James, who had asked excellent questions from the age of 2, developed into a young man with his father's quiet and his mother's directness, and at 18 went to work with Daniel in the shop, and the Sullivan Ironworks became a Millhaven institution, the kind of thing that a place is known for. Catherine, who had stood beside her father at 3 and said she wanted to do that, learned the ironwork alongside her brothers and proved, when she was old enough to properly try, that she had a gift for it, the same natural aptitude that Daniel had shown, the patience and the precision, and she and Clement spent hours in the shop together over the years, working and talking, and Grace would come down sometimes and stand in the doorway and watch. And the expression on her face at those moments was one that she did not need to compose, because composure had nothing to do with it. By 1890, Millhaven was a proper town, with a real schoolhouse and a proper church and 3 streets of houses, and a population of 800 and a reputation as a good place, the kind of town people came to and stayed in, which was what Grace had written in the essay that was Nora's essay. That is where we are now, and that is where we will stay. In the evenings of their later years, Clement and Grace sat on the steps of the shop and watched the valley and talked about what had happened and what was happening and what would happen. And the creek ran in the distance, and the hills went amber in the season. And Abraham had long since gone to his rest in the field behind the shop, honored with a small wooden marker that Henry had made before he left for Ohio, and that James had repainted in 1880, and that Catherine was responsible for now, taking the responsibility with the seriousness it deserved. The carved oak chest that had belonged to Thomas's mother sat in the front room of the Sullivan house, a piece of furniture that held quilts and letters and the objects that accumulate in a life lived fully. Nora's first published piece, Daniel's first completed ironwork, a simple hook kept as evidence, a pressed flower from California that Margaret had sent in a letter, the compass that Grace had used on the plains, which was set on the chest's surface and never moved because it was not decorative but real, a working compass that had pointed the way across Kansas and Colorado and Nevada, and still pointed north if you asked it. Grace had kept it out because Clement had asked her to once, years ago, when she had almost packed it away. He had held it and looked at it and said, quietly, "This brought you here." And she had looked at him and understood that he meant it as a fact and a marvel both, and she had left the compass on the chest, and it had been there ever since, pointing north in the front room of the house above the blacksmith shop in Millhaven, Nevada, in the valley with the golden hills and the clear-running creek, where Grace Gentry had broken a wheel and Clement Sullivan had come out to the street and told her the plain truth, and where everything had followed from that. It was a good life. It was a long life. It was the life that had waited at the end of the only road that could have led to it, and they had arrived at it together, not by accident, but by the combination of a broken wheel and a compass and a campfire and a creek crossing at 6 in the morning and 6 drafts of a letter and a bench in Sacramento, and a handshake on the main street of a town that turned out to be exactly the right size for a life that was exactly the right shape. And all of it from the first to the last, had begun because Grace Gentry had crossed the plains alone with her 4 children and arrived in Millhaven unbroken. That was the most remarkable thing. And Clement Sullivan said so, clearly and plainly and without exaggeration, every time he was asked, which was, in a life as full and as long as theirs, more times than either of them could count, and never once too many.